Hey, this is Mr. James. In this video, we're going to be talking about the midpoint formula. So to start, let's remember what a midpoint is. So remember, if we have a segment, something like this, a segment, call this segment A, B, okay? Then the midpoint of AB is the point, I guess, in between A and B, we'll call it C, such that AC and CB are the same length. So let's say that AB, this whole thing was something like, I don't know, 6 centimeters. Then the distance from A to C would be 3 centimeters. The distance from C to B would also be 3 centimeters. Okay, that's what a midpoint is. So how do we look at midpoints on a coordinate grid? Well, this first example is pretty straightforward. Here's one point. Here's another. I want to see if you can pick out where the midpoint is. Pause the video now and try and find the midpoint. Well, let's take a look. If this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 long, 6 units long, that means the midpoint must be 3 units in. So 1, 2, 3, and here is our midpoint. And let's write down the coordinate of that midpoint. The coordinate of the midpoint is going to be 1 in the x direction and looks like 5 in the y direction. So the coordinate of the midpoint is 1, 5. But what about something like this second example over here? The midpoint's a little harder to find. See if you can pause the video and figure out where on this line the midpoint should be. Just pause the video and try and place that dot for yourself. Figure out where it should be. All right, let's actually take a look. Well, it's kind of hard to figure out where the midpoint should go on here, and there's a bunch of different methods. However, the easiest one is to do this. Take a look at, from one point to the next, what the change in y and the change in x is, just like for slope. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's 5 in the x direction, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the y direction. So kind of plus 5 for x, plus 5 for y. It's kind of our rise and our run. Now, to go halfway from this point to the next point, to find our midpoint, we would go half of our rise and half of our run. So instead of going 5, we'll go over 2.5, because 2.5 is half of 5. So 1, 2.5, and up 1, 2.5, and we hit the line. Perfect. This right here is our midpoint. And if we would write that as a coordinate, that would be, let's see, in the x direction we're 1.5 over, so that's 1.5 for our x. And for our y, it looks like we're at -0.5. So all I've done to find our midpoint is taken our normal rise and run, divided them by 2, and found where that point is. Now, see, the thing is that sometimes it's hard to find the midpoint if you don't have a graph. And if we look at some of the problems below, something like 19 and 20, there's no graph with those. So we're going to have to figure out a way to look at this without using a graph. And here's what you can do. Find the coordinate of the two endpoints. So the coordinate of this is going to be -1, -3. And the coordinate of this endpoint is going to be 4, 2. Remember, x, y. Now, before we did is we went halfway between the x values. So remember, x is -1 and 4. And so how do you go halfway between -1 and 4? Well, to go halfway between -1 and 4, we would add those numbers together and then divide by 2. It's kind of like we're taking an average of those two numbers, adding them together and dividing by 2. So -1 plus 4 divided by 2. Let's see, -1 plus 4 is 3. 3 divided by 2 is 1.5. So 1.5 for in the x direction, my run. And then I also went halfway between the y values, right? The y values. So let's do the same thing. Add them together and divide by 2. So -3 plus 2 divided by 2. -3 plus 2 is -1, divided by 2 is -0.5, or -0.5. And if we go to that coordinate that we've just made, or 1.5 for the x's and -0.5 for the y's, let's see, 1.5 and then -0.5. There it is. There's my coordinate of the midpoint, 1.5 for the x's and -0.5 in the y direction. And so the midpoint formula is actually quite straightforward. You take your x's, x1, or we could even do x2 plus x1, doesn't matter the order. Add them together, divide by 2, you've got the x coordinate of the midpoint. For your y's, same thing. Take your y's, add them together, divide by 2 to get the y-coordinate of the midpoint. And that is the midpoint formula. Let's try and apply it. So for something like 17 and 18, you can either choose to find the midpoint by doing half the rise and half the run, like you saw above, or you can use the midpoint formula. I'll do both right now. So if I were to do half the rise and half the run to find the midpoint, my run is 1, my rise is 1, 2, 3, 4. So half of 1 is a half, so I'm going to go forward a half. And half of 4 is 2, so right there. And so this right here is my midpoint. And the coordinate of that will be, let's see, 3.5, 3.5 for the x, and for the y's it's 2. So 3.5 comma 2 would be the coordinate of my midpoint. Make sure you copy this down because I'm going to erase it in just a second to show you the other way. Now, if you don't want to do half the rise and half the run, you could use the midpoint formula by finding the coordinates of these 2 points, adding the x's, adding the y's, dividing by 2. So let's see, the coordinate of this first point is going to be 3, 0. The coordinate of the second point is going to be 4, 4. And so my midpoint formula tells me to take the x's, 4 plus 3, add them together, and divide by 2. Add those y's together, 4 and 0, and divide by 2. So 4 plus 3 is 7, and 4 plus 0 is 4. And then 7 divided by 2 is 3.5, and 4 divided by 2 is 2. So the coordinate of my midpoint is 3.5 comma 2. Let's double check. 1, 2, 3.5 for the x, and up 2. And there is the coordinate of my midpoint, 3.5 comma 2. All right, pause the video here and see if you can find the midpoint of the segment in 18. Please remember to pause the video. The answers are going to flash up on the screen in 3, 2, 1. So here's one way you could have done it, by doing half the rise and half the run to find the midpoint. The rise for this one is -1, and the run is 4. So to find the midpoint, I'll start at one point and go down a half and over 2. There's my midpoint, and it looks like the coordinate of that midpoint is going to be, let's see, 2 comma -1.5. There's another way you could have done it. Pause the video here if you want to copy this down. Otherwise, the other way is going to flash up in 3, 2, 1. You also could have found the coordinates of the 2 endpoints and then added the x values together. So 0 plus 4 and divided them by 2. And the y values as well. So -1 and -2. -1 plus -2. Divided that by 2. And let's see. 0 plus 4 is 4. Divided by 2 is 2. -1 plus -2 is -3. Divided by 2 is -1.5. And so if we go to our grid, that should be the coordinate of our midpoint. So 2, -1/2. There it is. 2, comma, -1.5. There's the coordinate of our midpoint. Either method works on a coordinate grid. However, both methods will not work for something like 19 and 20. Let's take a look. For 19 and 20, we don't have a coordinate grid, so we can't do half the rise and half the run. We're going to have to take the x values, add them together, and divide by 2. Let's do that now. So 10 plus 5 divided by 2. And the y values, add them together, and divide by 2. So -4 plus 1 divided by 2. 10 plus 5 is 15. -4 plus 1, it will leave us with -3. half of 15 is 7.5, 7.5, and half of -3 is going to be -1.5, and that right there is the coordinate of our midpoint. Pause the video here and see if you can do number 20. The answers are going to flash in front of the screen in 3, 2, 1. So you add the x's together and divide by 2, you add the y's together and divide by 2, and those form the coordinates of your midpoint, which should be -1, comma, -5. Thank you for watching so far. I'm going to go for another couple minutes to finish this up. I will push over 10 minutes with this video, but only by a little bit. So let's take these last couple questions. Find the other endpoint of the line segment with the given endpoint and midpoint. These questions are a little bit different from what we've seen before, but not any harder. Let me draw a picture to show you why. So drawing a little graph here with the endpoint, -8, comma, -8, and the midpoint, -10, comma, -10, right here. And so what we're saying is that we've got a segment. It starts at -8, comma -8. It goes halfway to -10, comma -10, and we're asking where does it end up? Well, it's actually not that bad. Remember, when you're trying to find a midpoint, we would take the rise and the run from the two endpoints and divide them by 2 to get to the midpoint. But since we already have the midpoint, we can take the rise and the run from the midpoint and an endpoint and multiply them by 2 or double them to get to the other endpoint. So let's see. From -8 to -10, okay, we seem to be subtracting 2. It's kind of our run. And from -8 to -10, we seem to be, again, subtracting 2. -2, -2. And so to get to the endpoint, we'll have to continue that and subtract another 2 from both the x and the y values, the rise and the run. And so that means the other endpoint will be at -12, comma -12. Pause the video here and see if you can figure out, given this endpoint and this midpoint, where the other endpoint has to be. Pause the video now. So let's take a look at 22. So we know that one endpoint is -5 and the midpoint is at 4. So from -5 to 4, we've increased by 9. 4 minus -5, yeah, 9. And so that's from one endpoint to the midpoint. So to get from the midpoint to the next endpoint, we would need to add another 9. So 4 plus 9 gives me 13. Same thing for the y's. We go from 2 to 9 from the endpoint to the midpoint, which is an increase of 7. And so to get from the midpoint to the other endpoint, we'll have to increase another 7, or I guess you can think of that as 14 the whole way. Either way, we get 9 plus another 7 gives us 16. 16 right there, 16. And so our other endpoint is 13, comma 16. Hope you've enjoyed this video. We pushed a little over 10 minutes, but not too far. These last two questions were a bit more challenging, but not too bad. Make sure you were pausing to try the practice problems, rewinding if you need, and please be ready for a video check next class.